My father was one of a very large Catholic family in southern Indiana. I never actually can remember what number of children there were, because sometimes they would count the children that were born, and sometimes they would only count the children that survived infancy. But it was something like 12. And he was the 10th of these, so he was one of the last ones. And at that time, I think the way the Catholic Church worked, if it provided a kind of lifeline for poor boys, at least, out of rural poverty. And so one of my father's older brothers succeeded in escaping that life of poverty by virtue of becoming a Catholic priest and becoming a teacher of Latin and Spanish, actually, at the University of Notre Dame. And my father idolized this older brother and wanted to become a priest too. So he went to the seminary and did the course of studies for a couple of years, but was then sent home for various reasons. And so he then went to work in a steel mill, and that was the way he spent the rest of his life. So he was a very devout Catholic, but he always had an interest in more general philosophical questions and historical questions. In particular, he had a view that the ancient world was very, very important. That was somehow connected with learning Latin and becoming a priest. And also, although he never would have admitted it himself, he didn't really believe in the papal doctrine of infallibility. That is, he knew he was supposed to believe that the Pope was infallible, and he tried his best. But it was clear from the way he talked about this question and the obsessive nature of his concern with it that he really didn't see how the Pope could conceivably be infallible. And this was a constant source of irritation to him. The other thing he was worried about was the corruption of the Catholic Church, the social corruption of the Church as an institution, and in particular the historical ways in which an institution like the Church is able to maintain itself as a continuing and vital institution despite the corruption of the personnel. And so I think in a way those two issues are two issues that I heard discussed by my father at great length when I was very young, not with a lot of theoretical sophistication, to be sure, because he didn't succeed in getting a higher education, but with a certain kind of relentless interest. And so on the one hand, there's a kind of skepticism. That is a skepticism about claims to infallibility, a skepticism about the opinions that authority asserts. That's always been a kind of component of my interest in the world. And the second part, I suppose, is something about how social institutions generate and renew themselves and reproduce themselves through making people believe in them. How does an institution that claims that kind of power and that kind of authority maintain itself over hundreds and thousands of years, despite the changing historical circumstances and despite the corruption of many of the people who are associated with the institution? So somehow some kind of skepticism and also some kind of interest in the role that what I later came to call ideologies play in social reproduction, the way in which the social imagination structures how we think about the world, and the way in which that structuration can be a force for good or a force for ill, the way in which we think about the world and we imagine the world as being one way rather than the other, and the way in which those forms of imagination might cause us to act in one way or cause us to act in another way, might succeed and might fail. Under what circumstances is a kind of imaginative construction, like the very idea of a church, which is an imaginative construction, in what sense can that kind of imaginative construction take on a life of its own and actually become a social institution rather than just someone's theory? And in what circumstances does that not work? And so in a way, I think that was the motivation, the early motivation for my interest in these sorts of things. Then there was a second important element, I think, and for that I'm afraid I have to engage in a kind of digression. During the Counter-Reformation, there was a Basque priest named Joseph Calazanxius who founded an order of priests that were devoted to the education of youth. They're called the priests of the pious schools. He founded them in Rome, and so the priests in this order took a special vow to devote their lives to the education of the youth. This was thought to be rather subversive in the 16th century, 17th century, when he founded this order. So the order was disbanded, but then it was reconstituted. And in the 19th century, it became very strong in Austro-Hungary, Poland, and in Spain. So there was a kind of Habsburg connection there. There was a Central European branch, and there was a Spanish branch. In 1948-49, the Hungarian branch lost its schools because, of course, the communist government in Hungary decided to secularize education. So the Piarists had these large number of schools in Hungary, and they were all taken by the government. Now, most of the priests left Hungary and went to Austria, where they also had some schools, but some of them stayed there. Now, shifting forward from 1949 to 1956, in 1956 there was, of course, an abortive uprising against the government in Hungary, and a large number of Hungarian refugees came out from Hungary to, first of all, to Austria, and many of them came to the United States. A lot of them came to a place called Camp Kilmer in New Jersey. And as they came through Austria, they picked up, roughly speaking, on the way, a number of these Hungarian priests who had left Hungary in 1949, just 7 or 8 years earlier, and who came with them. And they then decided they were going to have a school near Philadelphia, a boarding school for the children of these Hungarian refugees. That is, the order of priests was going to open a new school for these refugees. I went to that school. Now, that school represented a kind of bubble. It was a completely, in a way, completely artificial environment, because it was a boarding school in Pennsylvania in 1956, but it was set up for the children of Hungarians who'd just come from Hungary, and it was an attempt to reconstruct their idea of what a good, proper Central European gymnasium had been in 1930. So they had some idea of how things had been in the 1930s. Then came the war. Then came the communists, and so they were, as it were, like a beetle in a bubble of amber. They were going to redo this in 1958 in Pennsylvania. It was a boarding school, and that meant that they had the possibility of trying to implement this because they had total control. When I read that book by Goffman about total institutions, I immediately thought, my boarding school, that's where I went to school. So they had complete control over the environment. No radio, no television, no newspapers, etc. They were keen enough to continue education so that in addition to the boarding school, they also had a day school. But that meant that there was an internal incoherence in the structure of the school, in that the boarding people were all Hungarians. The day people were all local boys from this particular suburb of Pennsylvania. So I went to this school, and I encountered there a kind of both an extreme culture clash between these two sides, which I understood, as it were, as a form of attempts on the part of each group to project certain imaginative views about how the world was and how you ought to behave in it. Felt myself a bit in the middle of it, and I think that was an important component to this, to my interest in this too. Afraid that's all I can say at the spur of the moment. So ideology and the imagination. What is the human imagination? What is the individual imagination? What is the collective imagination? How does it come about that if you're put in the middle of a group of boys, all of whom are native speakers of Hungarian, and see the world through a set of issues that are determined by the history of the development of politics in Hungary in the 1930s and 40s, but you're actually living in the United States in 1958 or 59, how do you negotiate that? How do you negotiate that conjunction? So after being there, I then went to university in New York, and that was at the beginning, of course, of the 60s. I went there in 1963. As it were, they did a lot of good things for me in this school, taught me very good Latin, very good German, Russian, Greek, Italian. So I got very good training there. In fact, when I went to university, I found the general level of intellectual life there by no means more demanding than the kinds of things that had been expected of me in school. But it was it was yet another shock. And then, of course, coming to New York in 1963 at age, I was 18, I guess. I'd skipped a year in school. And the first thing that I encountered there as I got off the subway, was a demonstration against the wife of the then South Vietnamese dictator Diem. Diem was married to a woman named Madame Nhu, and there was some suggestion that he'd just been assassinated. There was some suggestion of U.S. complicity in the assassination of Diem, and Madame Nhu was a kind of slightly unsavory figure. There were a lot of racist remarks made about her, but anyway, I think despite that, she was a genuinely pretty unsavory figure, I think. And so that was a sort of kettle of fish that I was thrown into, too. So I think my life has been a series of attempts to negotiate different sorts of intellectual worlds, different kinds of imaginative universes, and I've been interested in the way in which participation in such a universe allows you to see certain things, but makes it difficult for you to see other sorts of things. So...
You went to Columbia, right?
Yes, I was an undergraduate at Columbia.
Now, I remember, I keep coming up in the interviews. I mean, my first impression as an outsider, some 50 years old, entering the Columbia campus for the first time, coming off the street onto that mall,
yes.
And thinking that I was walking into both the most frightening piece of architecture I'd ever seen, and in some ways the most successful. An architecture that was also defining a world,
yes.
And quite an ideal
Yes.
world, and an ideal
Yes.
world in which I was a very tiny speck.
Yes.
And also defining a world in opposition to, in separation from the street life
Yes.
outside it.
Yes.
And I'm interested, given your kind of interest coming in these idealized,
Yes.
projected on reality sorts of
Yes.
worlds, how you found Columbia.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are places in which the architecture is connected with the environment in a very, very obvious way. There are, as it were, unique solutions to the problems that are posed by a certain kind of environment. You couldn't have Venice anywhere except where it is. And given where it is, how else could you do it? And similarly, of course, the island of Manhattan, as you know, is very tight, and it's made of granite. So that means it's a limited space, and it can give you very firm foundations very quickly. So there's a tendency to build up rather than to build out. If you compare, for example, the architecture, actually the central area of your university here, which I've just seen, reminds me a bit of Columbia, in that it has that central courtyard structure with a colonnaded building at the top. It reminds me a bit of it, but not really, because there's still some sense here of being on the Great Plains, of an openness. There's a kind of lucidity there. So I agree with you. There is something tremendously self-contained about Columbia as an architectural entity. It's a kind of womb. It's an internal space. Those buildings mark out an internal space within which various things happen. But you can also see it, as it were, as a wonderful theater. If you think of it as a place in which you stand in front of a library and you look in one direction, you look at the other, there's a kind of surveyability, almost a kind of Foucaultian surveyability about the whole thing. And I think for me, being 16 when I came there, it was rather, and having had the history that I had, it was rather better for me to have a kind of well-structured environment there in which I could feel I wasn't simply directly emerged into the life of the city, and there was a bit of structure there. And I was there for several years. And the first year, I didn't, that was my world. And you gradually begin to explore that which is outside. And so I didn't. So I agree with the general point, but I think for me that was not the way I experienced it. I experienced that there was something comforting about it being so surveyable and self-contained. And I went about my work there, and that was that.
Yeah. Well, I think the people I know who love the church and the people I know who love their high schools,
yes,
love them because they provided a comforting place,
yes,
out from which they could go to explore, but without the sense that they were wide open to anything.
Mm. Well, I don't love the church, I should say. I mean, I don't love the church, and I would be hard-pressed to say that I love that school, because that school doesn't exist anymore, right? That school does exist, but it doesn't exist. Namely, the school I knew was a school that could only exist in that tiny fragment of time between 1956 and, say, 1965. During that time, there was a group of Hungarian kids who came to this country and who gave the place a certain kind of ethos. The people whom I knew were reading Camus and Sartre. They weren't sort of going and playing basketball. There was a certain kind of culture that they maintained there. That group has, of course, passed on and become Americanized. There was a friend of mine who had two brothers, and you could see the development. He was obviously a native speaker of Hungarian who spoke English. His younger brother was bilingual, and his younger brother was a native speaker of English who spoke a little bit of Hungarian. And so, a school like that could only continue to exist if there was a continual drip of a continual influx of people from another place, and that wasn't the case. So I think it doesn't have a boarding section now. So it's just a day school and serves basically the people in that area around Philadelphia. Perfectly laudable thing to do, but it's not the school I knew, as it were.
So, having had the opportunity to experience bordered worlds,
yes,
responding to a kind of mythic ideal and able to, at least temporarily,
suspend reality.
Yes. And impose that vision on everyone within the magnetic field.
Yes.
What did you come to think of those worlds, that project, that possibility in human life, which emerges and then disappears depending on circumstances like an influx of Hungarians, or in the case of the case of the Twin Cities, a very similar story is found in Patricia Hempel's Virgin Time, talking about nuns of European training coming to run a girls' school in St. Paul and educating people as if they were aristocratic French women, or being trained for good matches in a Paris that didn't exist anymore.
Yes. Well, I mean, if you ask the general question, what do I think of that? I very rarely have a straight answer to that kind of question. I think one of the great virtues of a philosopher, one of the philosophers I'm interested in, the philosopher Nietzsche, is that he thinks that if you ask the question, is Christianity a good thing or not, the question in that form simply doesn't make sense. You can't say yes or no to that. What you have to do is you have to look at the particular kind of needs particular people have at particular times. You have to look at the particular version of Christianity that's involved. You have to look at the way in which the two of them interact with one another. You have to look at the way. And so I might say that for you, say, this particular version of Christianity was useful in this way. For someone else it might not be. And it seems to me that's a more interesting question than the general question about whether such... I can't actually give an answer to that question. I think that a world in which it was not possible to maintain some kind of structuration of smaller spheres within it would be a world in which we'd lost a lot of things that are of value. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago called "The World is Flat," which I think an economist which said, well, you can play golf now anywhere in the world. You can go to India and play golf, and everything is more or less the same. And if it really comes to be the case that everything in the world is just the same, and there's no local environment, and the local environment can't have an internal form of structuration which allows certain particular things to flourish there and other things not, then I think that would be a genuine loss. But that's, as it were, a general theoretical statement about one kind of world as opposed to another kind of world, and not a particular judgment about this case. I then went to Germany, of course, and that was the other thing that happened in my life. I spent the 70s and 80s basically moving back and forth between Germany and the United States. 2 years one place, 2 years another place, until I finally emigrated to Britain in '93, and I've been there ever since. It's very hard, it's always been very hard for me to find a combination of an intellectual climate I liked and found congenial, where I felt I could work. I can't work if I'm not in a congenial environment. I know I probably ought to be more independent, but so finding an intellectual world in which I can work, and also finding a world in which there's a life outside that life, where there's an interesting urban structure or an interesting structure of some other kind. And I didn't find the appropriate combination of that for me till I moved to Cambridge. So.
Just as a general thing, do you think of the discipline of philosophy as erosive of these special places that you take to be important for our humanity?
Not if properly done. No, because I think that there's no particular reason to think that forms of controlled reflection might not be possible in any number of different such contexts. For example, in my school, you could think about, I should say, the priest in my school was actually rather interesting, had complete contempt for Thomism. I mean, the last thing they wanted was to be one of these sort of primitive Thomists, people who sort of literal reading of St. Thomas. They thought that was tying the wagon of the church to a medieval obscurantist tradition that really had nothing to do with Catholicism. It was just an accidental conjunction that had happened in the late Middle Ages, and we should get rid of it altogether. And so they were perfectly willing to discuss all sorts of things that I think someone who grew up in another rather more intellectually repressive form of Catholicism would have found difficult to take seriously or to discuss. So there were perfectly free forms of philosophical activity that went on there. Similarly, there are perfectly free forms of intellectual activity that went on, I'm sure, in lots of other institutions that were not religiously oriented. So I think, unless you have a very narrow conception of what philosophy can be and must be, I don't see that it has to be corrosive of these sorts of things. I take it to be just a kind of general attempt to get as clear as possible about what we can know about the world, what we can't know about the world, what's real, what's imaginary, what the relation between those two things is, what's good, what's bad. That sort of reflection is part of our natural endowment as human beings. That's not going to run away from us. I think a lot of philosophers have I think it's very important when you talk to people to find out what they're afraid of. You know, the motivation for a lot of philosophical positions, I think, is a great fear people have, an irrational fear people have of certain things. So the people who are obsessed with relativism are afraid of something, and that causes them to have the kind of hysterical focus on defeating relativism that you often find. And I'm afraid I'm not at all afraid that philosophy is going to fall out of existence or dissolve itself. Or, in fact, that these small microenvironments will dissolve themselves. I think that's part of what we as human beings will continue to generate. Some of these microenvironments can be put out of existence if the political authorities or other authorities are sufficiently keen on doing that. And that's, of course, something one has to evaluate on its own terms. It might be good, it might be bad, depending on what they are. But I don't think one has to worry about that. I think philosophy is going to be around, and these sorts of relatively more self-enclosed groupings are going to be around, and we have to look at them and take them for what they are.
What do you see as philosophy's contribution to human life as you practice it?
Again, that question presupposes that there's this thing, human life, and then philosophy is this kind of luxurious thing that comes from somewhere else. And there's human life, and then there's, I don't know, gold-plated Cadillacs. And how can we afford to have gold-plated Cadillacs, given that the world is so badly off? That's not the way I think about the world at all. My father spent his life working in the steel mill. He had a keen interest in these questions. He didn't have a sophisticated ability to deal with many of them. He didn't get very far. But I don't see that. I don't see the two of those entities, namely daily life and philosophy, as having that kind of dichotomous relation to each other. I think we're always asking questions about what's good and what's bad. We're always asking questions about what we know, what we merely think we know, what we imagine, what we don't imagine, what's real, what's not real. And as long as those questions continue to be asked, there's some kind of philosophy being done. And so, I mean, I don't see that as a luxury. It's not a luxury or a necessity. It's just a part of human life. That's what we are as human beings.
So what you do as a professional philosopher, someone who spends a great deal of time with this, is just a sort of continuation of what's happening as a natural part of lots of lives, perhaps in a more limited time, perhaps with more limited conceptual tools, but it's essentially the same thing that your father was doing in reflecting when he came home from supper, came home to supper from the steel mill. It's the same thing.
How can the Pope claim he's infallible? Now that is in a way too banal a way to describe it, but in a way it's also too exalted a way of describing it, because I also think that the way to think about many of these questions actually is a way that ought to be historically informed. That is, I don't think you can, in asking these questions, start from nothing. I think you also have to think about why you're thinking about the question in the way you're thinking about it. Why does the question arise in that form? Why doesn't it arise in the other form? To understand that, you have to understand something about history. So my actual activity, my everyday activity, has kind of two sides to it. On the one hand, I do these lectures in which I talk about what the state is and what is violence and how should we distinguish between coercion and violence. And various sorts of things. On the other hand, I talk about the history of philosophy. I talk about Max Weber and the way in which Max Weber thought about the state. And I think about the ancient world and try to suggest to people that if you thought about these questions from the point of view of some of the ancient philosophers, they would look completely different. And does that throw some light on the way we might reflect on them? So it isn't as if there isn't a cognitively disciplined component to it, but I see that as being continuous with a kind of activity, general activity of reflection, which, as I said, I don't think is going to go away.
There were lots of people in England, people who are now taken seriously, studied in a canonical way and dissected, who didn't have a lot of use for history, for the history of the questions they were addressing, who would sometimes not make any explicit references back beyond, people they'd actually conversed with, or people who'd written articles.
Yes.
I mean, Wittgenstein knew Schopenhauer, and he knew a whole lot of other stuff, but he's not Kierkegaard. I mean, Kierkegaard footnoted till he turned green. I mean, and you don't find footnotes of any substance there. And I'm wondering kind of how you think about being someone who brings the historical picture in, teaching in a place where some very great philosophers thought they could get by without doing that.
Well, there are different styles of philosophy. There are different styles of thinking. There are different styles of living. The way I live wouldn't suit everyone. And the way I think wouldn't suit everyone. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong about that. With that, it does strike me though that in the case of many of the people who think they're being Descartes, that is, who think that their way of philosophical reflection is actually not dependent on history or isn't satiated with history. That does seem to me, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, to be a form of very deep self-delusion. If you look at the questions they ask, they're doing just as much the history of philosophy as anyone else who does the history of philosophy is doing the history of philosophy. It just turns out that it's the history of 5 years ago rather than the history of 2 centuries ago. I mean, they're actually, they're deeply, if the point is the historical determinacy of what they're doing, the questions they're asking and the lines of argument they're considering and the way they're thinking about the question is just as much dependent on what actually happened to have been published in the relevant journals 2 years previously as is the reflection that I might make on Hegel in the 19th century. So I don't see that the structure is really different, although they may misunderstand themselves as engaged in something with a completely different structure. So I just think that, again, that's part of the mix of human life. And also, I mean, I also think that lots of illusions are very useful for people. And so if, in fact, people need, if, in fact, Wittgenstein needed to think that he was really reflecting in a way that was not at all determined by the historical context in which he stood, if that's what he needed to write his works, well, good, let's celebrate that.
So it's basically, it's a matter of style, it's a matter of how one works, to what extent one can make progress through explicitly acknowledging the ways in which one is part of a dialogue with predecessors of some sort, whether they're predecessors in the last issue of Mind or predecessors going back 2,000 years.
I mean, the big danger in philosophy is scholasticism. But scholasticism is not, but scholasticism is a category that doesn't map on neatly onto that other distinction between doing it more historically or doing it less historically. There are scholastic ways of doing the history of philosophy. There are scholastic ways of doing so-called systematic philosophy. I, of course, think that scholasticism is a bad way to go about philosophic activity. By that I mean a kind of dogmatic way of proceeding in which you assume that the framework of reference is given and it's not to be questioned, and you simply have to fit little bits of things into one or another of the existing categories, and you multiply distinctions that only make sense if you make some assumptions that are themselves questionable and ought to be reflected on. I mean, so scholasticism is a continual thing one has to struggle against in philosophy. But that doesn't mean that people who do philosophy historically have a monopoly on being reflective about what they're doing.
So, I guess if this attention to the history of the ideas you're working with is a matter of style, I'm curious about what you have found valuable or important in adopting that style, in a certain sense, to represent it not as the way to do philosophy, but to represent it as one plausible way to do it philosophy that has certain advantages, certain attractions. If one thinks about people watching this as people who want to think about the world in a fruitful way and are looking for approaches, what can be said about this attention to the history of the ideas you're engaged with?
I think it's probably the case that I tend to have the views that I have because my interests are mostly in ethics and political philosophy, where I think it seems to me clear that if you look at the ways people will think about their world naturally, spontaneously, in any given society, but in ours in particular, if you think about the way we would naturally think about our world, you will be, and you do that without thinking about the origin of a lot of these terms and concepts, you'll be liable to get yourself tangled in completely inextricable, in a completely inextricable mess of things. I think it's really important to think about terms like democracy, republic, the state, human rights. They are the sorts of things I've thought about. And I think there's a kind of unreflective use of those terms in political life that is natural to people, and there's nothing wrong with it. But those terms carry with them a kind of set of historical assumptions and historical baggage, so that if you begin to think about them seriously without thinking about where the concepts and the terms came from and what they actually mean and what they meant historically and why they've changed the meaning in the way they have, you're liable to make very serious mistakes. As you know, no one believed democracy was something good until the 20th century. I mean, until the late 19th century, democracy was a term of abuse. The Federalist Papers, people who write in the Federalist Papers say, well, of course we don't want a democracy. That would be ridiculous. We want a republic. Well, what does it mean that in the late 18th century, democracy was a term of abuse, republic was a term that could be used, whereas in the late 20th century, the early 21st century, first of all, everybody's a Democrat. You can't find anyone, a Democrat with a small d, obviously. You can't find any regime that doesn't in some sense describe itself as democratic. And republic, democracy, liberalism are treated more or less as if they're interchangeable ideas. And I think there a little bit of historical clarity about what the terms mean, where they came from, and what historical baggage they come along with, and how those terms have changed under the pressure of political events, would help people somewhat to negotiate their way through what would otherwise be very, very dense woods indeed. The state, after all, is by its very nature coercive. One of my colleagues, Quentin Skinner, wrote this famous series of papers in which he tries to show that the concept of the state is introduced in the 17th century precisely in order to give us a locus for authority and power that is independent of doctrines of popular sovereignty. So the very concept of the state, as it were, is a reactionary, counter-revolutionary thought. Because in a democracy, there isn't any state, right? For the Greeks, to have a democracy, right? The Greek conception of democracy was elections are undemocratic because you elect the best person. That means you elect someone who's not just a regular member of the society. Democracy is based on the lot. You choose people at random. And so you're in a situation in which so popular sovereignty is a powerful appeal to, as it were, non-judgmentally qualified, the non-judgmentally qualified decisions of everyone in society. Not the people who are elected, not the people who know better, but everybody. And so what do you do in the face of that in the 16th, 17th century? Well, you invent this concept of the state, and you say, no, we've got this other thing. There's the popular will, of course, the popular will. But there's also this institution, the state. There's the state of France. And that is a separate, abstract locus of power, whose legitimacy is not derived from that of the population. And then gradually, basically since that time, people have tried to square the circle. I mean, they've been engaged in a completely, utterly pointless enterprise of trying to show how the state can be democratic. States can't be democratic. The state is by its very nature a structure that's going to coerce you, that's not supposed to be democratic. It's the thing that intervenes and prevents people from doing what they want to do. And I think if you begin to think about it that way, and think about it with a little bit of history, the history looks a little bit different, and your attitude toward the world might be a little bit different. Doesn't mean that you think democracy is a bad thing. It doesn't mean that you think democracy in the contemporary sense is a bad thing. But it means that you'll be unlikely to surround particular contemporary conceptions of democracy with thurifers swinging with incense and bowing at the altar of this concept. Because you'll see that it's a concept that has a very, very speckled history and is connected with all sorts of things which you might think are actually unrealizable in the modern world. Anyway, that's the sort of thing that I do.
I'm puzzled sometimes by the thought that what's really structuring, by just, not so much thought, but by observations that suggest that what's really structuring political behavior has diverged so widely from the philosophical discussions that are purportedly about it that I just wonder, am I living? Have I fallen down the rabbit hole? I mean, here's one. I mean, you live in Britain. You live under a monarch.
Yes.
And the monarchy is, they keep debating whether it's out or on its way out, or whether it's useful for tourism or helpful in certain sorts of crises. But I take it, the lively debate about monarchy and aristocracy is not in the front row of political science, political philosophy disputes. You're not fighting about monarchs seriously, and all the language about monarchy and aristocracy and hereditary stuff is, that's ancient, cobwebby stuff.
Yeah.
And yet in the United States, it seems to me, statistically, that we've been enacting monarchy more or less continuously since the founding, that if anything, the tendency is much stronger now in every level to enact the idea that all sorts of the most central roles in the state are hereditary, that they're passed from father to son to grandson. We keep generating dynasties, and nobody's talking about dynasties. I mean, dynasty, the word, you bring in the word dynasty and people say Romanovs. They don't say Bushes. They don't say Kennedys. But in fact, there are dynasties all over the place, and there are people who will defend them. And there's quite a lot actually to be said in defense of them, and it's an interesting...
But it's an argument that cannot be put. That's the interesting thing. There's all sorts of things that could be said in favor of having political dynasties, but they're not arguments that could be put in the framework which we've established for ourselves at the moment. We're having a general election just as we speak now. So in fact, I voted by postal ballot, but they're just doing their thing at the moment, and there may well be a constitutional crisis, of course, because David Cameron has said that if he wins a plurality but not a majority, he's going to challenge the traditional view, which is that the existing prime minister stays on until he's been defeated in a vote of confidence. So and now that's a question of constitutional unclarity. Of course, there isn't a written constitution, so how do you know that that's the fact about the constitution? So that's a question that's very topical. But as far as your basic point is concerned, I wrote this book a couple of years ago called Philosophy and Real Politics, in which I tried essentially to argue in the direction of what you've just been saying now. That is, if you look at what political philosophers, I shouldn't say this because I don't mean to be sort of doing down the other people who do the area, but if you look at most of what political philosophers have thought about and have talked about in the past 60 or 70 years, it strikes me it's completely disconnected from the political reality of the world altogether. There's some view that political philosophy should be a kind of ethical enterprise. We should consult our intuitions about what's morally good, and we should think about a structure of rights, and then we should think about what ideal democratic things are, etc. And it seems to me it's much more important to look at the societies that we actually have and the relations of power that exist in those societies. So I'm actually very much in favor of what I took to be the upshot of your suggestion, which is don't look at the relation between human rights and democracy. That's not unimportant, but don't start there. Don't start by assuming we know what a human right is. Don't start by assuming we know what democracy is. Look around and look at and see who has power. What are the institutions through which power is actually structured, condensed, and exercised? And once you understand as much as you can understand about how power is structured, how it's exercised, then try to move on from that to some kind of evaluation of which ways you can move the structures that exist in a way that will make them more conformable to the satisfaction of human needs and to the realization of our human impulses. So I couldn't agree with that more.
I did 2 stints of teaching applied ethics ages ago. One first with business ethics before they chased me out, and I basically got it straight after a while that whatever was in the text, you could be sure was not the issue. And there are lots of political reasons why it's not the issue. It has to do with the fact that it's not very safe to name the actual issue. You want to name an issue that you've solved already, or an issue that's containable. The non-containable issues you don't talk about, but the students will. It's like when I walked into the room and said the word ethics, 80% of my job as a teacher had been done. Because in every head of any experienced person in the room, and there were mostly experienced people, there was one thing that they were thinking of. This was the thing that they had been part of that had made them question the meaning of their lives. And the whole game was, will they tell that story?
Well, I think there are a number of very peculiar difficulties in doing that kind of job, applied ethics. One is that as an academic, one is constantly under the pressure. There's a kind of internal disciplinary pressure to focus on that about which you can say something that's that you can give an argument for. There's a kind of priority of the thing which you can say clearly, a priority of that for which you can give a good argument, what is teachable, what is reproducible. You can say it, they can say it back to you, you can grade it. There's a strong discipline, there's a strong pressure that comes from the nature of the discipline to get unclear things out and not to discuss them. Then second, of course, there's another pressure, which is a pressure to avoid things that are genuinely upsetting for people and genuinely controversial. That is, where people don't just say they disagree, but they really do disagree, and it's a difference in their very lives that's at stake, not just an intellectual issue. And I think if you're working in an area where there are both of those pressures, namely to avoid the things that are really upsetting to people and to avoid the things that you can't say anything about that you can't talk about rather clearly, it's very, very hard to. I've never actually taught ethics. That's part of the reason for it. I just think it requires a kind of iron constitution to do it, an iron constitution and a great human flexibility to do it.
But the reason I mentioned the applied ethics context, I wanted to say the same thing came up when I moved to medical ethics.
Right.
Again, it seemed to me, and the same people were writing the books.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that the issues that were important were in the heads of my students.
Right.
And the books were there to name the issues that it was safe to talk about,
yes,
which weren't the ones that were important,
yes,
by and large.
Yes.
They were the ones that had been important some years ago, in a certain way.
Yes.
Now, my puzzle is, isn't it the same business when you teach political philosophy? I mean, if I were to walk into a political philosophy class and say, let us talk about the dynastic components of American history and the deep commitment that Americans have to biological notions that have been scientifically discredited, to a dynastic conception of leadership, people would wonder, because that's not the curriculum.
Yes, you're making me feel very inadequate, because I would love to be able to do what you described, that is, to adopt the genuinely Socratic method and to start the year without any kind of curriculum or preconception whatever, and to tease out from the audience what they actually thought were the issues that they wanted some kind of grip on and move with them. But I've never actually done that, and I would say that would be extraordinarily labor-intense. Part of the reason is it would be extraordinarily labor-intense. It would be almost like doing psychoanalysis with them. It would be a very hands-on thing. It would require tremendous commitment on the part of both people involved. You wouldn't know where it was going. It would be uncontrollable. The university authorities wouldn't be able to tell whether I had gone through the curriculum appropriately. We wouldn't be able to tick any boxes. So you're absolutely right. That kind of activity it's very difficult to accommodate it within a disciplinary, in the kind of disciplinary universe that we inhabit, where we have to do certain topics and they have to be examined on certain topics. So I agree with you completely that I suppose I sort of fall down on that thing altogether, except to the extent to which with some of the graduate students it's possible to create a kind of free space in which they can explore some of these issues without the pressure of constantly having to be evaluated. We have at Cambridge a good system of supervisions, individual supervisions, and that has the great advantage that when the students come in for the supervisions, they're not graded on that. So they write an essay for me, they come in, we talk about the essay. I'm never in a position in which I will grade them. So there's a complete separation of instruction and examination. So they're examined at the end of the year by a completely different board of people. They know that nothing they say to me, they can't tell me what I want to know. I mean, they can tell me what I want to know. There's no advantage to them in doing that. And there, in some of those contexts, you can begin to do some of that. But I have to agree, that's a very, very small amount of what one actually does and gets paid for. So I suppose that's right.
Well, I mean, I envy that piece of the system. I think no one has ever, it seems to me, given a decent answer to the question of why grading one's own students is not the same kind of conflict of interest as evaluating one's own products for their
Absolutely.
fitness.
Absolutely.
And I mean, in a certain sense, there's a constellation of grades.
Yes.
I cannot give my
Yes.
students
Yes.
and keep teaching.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the fact that there is a constellation
Yes.
that will not go through, no matter what the information I have is from the students,
Yes.
that fact seems to me queers the process.
Yes.
Just as having Johnson & Johnson determine whether it's Tylenol is up to snuff for feeding to babies
Yes.
is a bad idea.
Yes.
They're really it's the preposterous sort of political problem within the educational system. But I want to ask this, and I suppose this could get back to Cambridge, but you can avoid this question if you want. Are you well enough protected in your teaching so that you can, if you choose, teach in conformity with your ethical convictions about how something should be done?
Well, I'm at the end of my career now. I've got another couple of years before I retire, so it really doesn't matter to me. I mean, in a way, I'm in a privileged position in that, what can happen to me? So I do what I want. That, in a way, isn't the right question. The right question is what is the situation for those who will come after, who are there already and who are about to come. And I'm afraid I don't have any idea what the university system in the Western world is going to look like in 10 years. I think that the shifts in global power and resources, the demands of competition among nation states, and various associated phenomena of environmental degradation, I think all of those things means that our societies are going to change very, very drastically, are going to have to change very, very drastically in the next 10 years or so. Or if they don't, they're going to collapse completely, and that's going to be an even worse disaster. And to be frank, I don't know how that's going to work. I would certainly say that if I were 25, I wouldn't aspire to a career teaching in philosophy in a university. But then I'm not 25, so I'd do something else with my life.
What would you do?
If I had an answer to that question, I would. If I had had an answer to that question 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, I would be doing it now. But I don't. So I don't.
You're quite
I don't
clear.
have any. I don't have any ability. I don't have any abilities that I could use to survive. Really, apart from, I used to think in the '60s when I was somewhat more politically oriented, that I should sort of not embark on an academic career, but I should do something that was really more helpful or practical. And then I looked at my father's job in the steel mill, and what he did basically was contribute to producing bits of steel that went to make tail fins on cars and things. And the idea that that was somehow more real or more deeply connected with human needs just didn't seem plausible to me. So there are some jobs that are really obviously connected with with the satisfaction of human needs, like being a nurse or being a doctor or being something like that. But I don't have any of the skills or abilities that one would need to do that. So I don't know. I think that's a question without an answer. At least for me, it's a question without an answer. But again, I also tend to be a skeptic about these things. I have a different, I have a kind of survival idea of the world. I think of the world as this horrible place. And you have to get through, you have to sort of get through to your death without having too many of your limbs lopped off before you get through to your death, and just survive, rather than a kind of the view that I think a lot of people have, which is the future should be open and you should develop your possibilities, etc. I understand that view, find it in Marx, of course, but it's not actually the one I share. And so my view is, well, I've survived this far, and what more can happen to me now at my age? That's not very socially responsible, but
it's, I mean, the question you raise, what can a person with strong conceptual abilities contribute to helping out?
well, there are things that one can do. I mean, there are lots of areas in the social sciences, I think, where analytical and historical ability can be used. I suspect that that's more in the context of research than of teaching. Well, for example, last year I went to a conference in Berlin, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, and they had all of these people discussing climate change. It was extremely interesting. They had physicists, people who worked on the nature of the gases in the atmosphere, and economists. And there were a lot of them that were in research institutes of one kind or another. And I think they led a rather precarious existence, but they were doing something that I think was very, very useful. They were analyzing carbon inputs, and they were doing various sorts of things. And I think if I'd had that ability, that would have been something that would have been, I definitely think people like that are making important contributions.